September 14th, 1943. At 08:20 hours. Combined Fleet Intelligence Center, Truk Lagoon, Caroline Islands. Commander Minoru Genda pressed his palm against the steel bulkhead of the converted freighter that served as the Imperial Japanese Navy's forward intelligence headquarters, steadying himself as another headache pulsed behind his eyes. The intercepted American radio traffic lay spread across his desk, like autopsy photographs of Japan's dying naval superiority. Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Lexington. The names multiplied with each weekly intelligence summary, each one representing a fleet carrier that shouldn't exist. Chusa-sama, Lieutenant Takeshi Naito's voice carried the practiced neutrality of a junior officer delivering news that would anger his superior. The morning intercepts from Hawaii confirm another commissioning ceremony. USS Bunker Hill, CV-17, December delivery expected. Genda didn't look up from the chart where red circles marked American carrier positions across the Pacific, like a spreading infection. His fingers, still scarred from burns suffered at Pearl Harbor when he'd coordinated that perfect attack from Akagi's bridge, traced the line of new Essex-Class vessels. 7 operational. 3 more completing sea trials. 4 under construction that American newspapers cheerfully announced to the world, as if daring Japan to do something about it. That makes 8 since Essex herself was commissioned, Genda said quietly. His voice held no emotion, which Naito knew meant his commander was furious. 8 fleet carriers in 10 months. We lost 4 at Midway 15 months ago. We've replaced none. The mathematics sat in the room like an unwelcome truth that both officers understood, but neither wanted to speak aloud. When Genda had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941, the combined fleet possessed 10 aircraft carriers against America's 7. Japan had sunk Lexington at Coral Sea in May 1942. At Midway 1 month later, American dive bombers had sent Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu to the bottom. Japan had believed Yorktown sank too at Midway, making 5 American carriers destroyed in just 4 weeks. The Imperial Japanese Navy had celebrated those victories. The Emperor himself had sent commendations. Admiral Yamamoto, despite his private reservations, had assured the Naval General Staff that American carrier strength was crippled for at least 2 years, possibly longer. They had assumed, because every calculation and historical precedent demanded they assume, that aircraft carrier construction required 3 to 4 years minimum. Complex vessels, specialized facilities, trained workers, limited industrial capacity fighting a 2-ocean war. They had assumed wrong. Chusa-sama, there's more. Naito placed another decoded intercept on the desk, this one from the American West Coast. Keel laying ceremony at Newport News, CV-18 to be named Wasp, expected completion July 1944 and... He hesitated, knowing this would be the worst part. The Americans are advertising in newspapers for workers to staff a new carrier construction facility in Philadelphia. Genda finally looked up, his eyes meeting Naito's. The younger officer saw something he'd never seen before in his commander's face. Not anger, not frustration, but the cold recognition of inevitable defeat that a drowning man experiences when his lungs fill with water. "Show me the production estimates again," Genda ordered. "All of them." Naito retrieved the folder that both men now knew by heart. The intelligence had been compiled from multiple sources. Captured documents from Guadalcanal, radio intercepts from American shipyards, reports from submarines that had observed American ports, even information from sympathetic observers in neutral countries who watched American ships transit the Panama Canal. Every source confirmed what seemed impossible. The Essex-Class program, Naito read from the summary his staff had prepared, was authorized under the Two-Ocean Navy Act in July 1940. First 3 vessels ordered from Newport News Shipbuilding. 8 more ordered September 1940. 2 more December 1941, 8 days after Pearl Harbor. After America's declaration of war, Congress appropriated funds for 19 additional Essex-Class carriers. 32 total ordered, Genda interrupted. How many do we assess will actually be completed? American shipyards are operating at capacity we consider— Naito struggled for the right word. Incomprehensible. They're building these carriers in 14 to 16 months from keel laying to commissioning. Based on current production rates, we estimate 20 to 24 Essex-Class carriers will be completed by war's end. The silence that followed was broken only by the humid tropical air moving through the inadequate ventilation system. Genda stood and walked to the large wall map that showed the Pacific Theater. Red pins marked Japanese-controlled territory, which still sprawled impressively across the map, from the Aleutians to Indonesia, from Wake Island to Burma. Blue pins marked American positions, currently limited to Australia, Hawaii, and a tenuous grip on Guadalcanal. But the blue pins were multiplying. Each Essex-Class carrier, Genda said, speaking as if to himself, can operate 90 to 100 aircraft, superior damage control, heavy anti-aircraft armament, designed specifically from lessons learned in this war. He turned back to Naito. And we're building what to counter them? Naito consulted his notes, though both men knew these numbers too. Shinano is under conversion from the 3rd Yamato-class battleship hull, expected completion late 1944. Unryu, Amagi, and Katsuragi are under construction, light carriers of approximately 17,000 tons, expected completion throughout 1944. 3 light carriers and 1 conversion, Genda said, against 20 American fleet carriers. And that's not counting their light carriers, their escort carriers, their— He stopped, the headache intensifying. Where is Admiral Yamamoto? The Admiral is at Rabaul, Chusasama. He's planning another offensive in the Solomons. Genda almost laughed. Another offensive. With what? The combined fleet's carrier strength consisted of Zuikaku, Shokaku, when repairs were completed, and a handful of light carriers. The Americans would have those new Essex-class vessels operating in groups of 4 or 5, covering each other, rotating back for maintenance and rearmament, while fresh carriers rotated forward. An endless carousel of naval air power that Japan simply could not match. The sound of footsteps on the metal deck announced the arrival of Captain Yasuji Watanabe, the senior intelligence officer for the combined fleet. His face carried the expression of a man who had been arguing with superiors and losing. "Genda-san," Watanabe said, dropping the honorific formality that usually governed Japanese naval hierarchy. They'd served together since the China operations in the 1930s, when naval aviation was new and exciting and the future seemed to belong to those who understood its potential. "I've just returned from the staff meeting with Admiral Koga." Admiral Minechi Koga had assumed command of the combined fleet after Yamamoto's death in April. He was competent, respected, but he wasn't Yamamoto. More importantly, he didn't possess Yamamoto's deep understanding of American industrial capacity, gained from the Admiral's years living in the United States. "What did you tell him?" Genda asked. "Everything. The production numbers, the commissioning schedule, the implications for our defensive perimeter." Watanabe sat heavily in the chair by Genda's desk. He didn't believe half of it. Said American propaganda had clearly infiltrated our intelligence estimates. That no nation could build that many fleet carriers that quickly while also fighting in Europe. "What did you say?" I showed him the photographic reconnaissance from our submarine I-175's periscope observations of Pearl Harbor last month. 5 Essex-Class carriers clearly visible, with at least 2 more in the outer anchorage areas. I showed him the intercepted messages from American shipyards coordinating parts deliveries. I showed him the newspaper articles. The Americans don't even try to hide their construction programs. And he said we should focus on quality over quantity, that one well-trained Japanese carrier group could defeat 3 American carriers, that Yamato and Musashi would provide the decisive firepower in the next major engagement. Watanabe's voice carried a bitterness that bordered on insubordination. He's a battleship admiral, Genda-san. He doesn't understand what we're facing. Genda returned to his desk and pulled out a folder marked with the highest security classification. Inside were reports that only a handful of officers in the entire Imperial Japanese Navy had seen. Intelligence gathered from multiple sources, pieced together over months, confirmed by neutral observers and American POWs. The Americans, Genda read from the summary he'd written himself, are operating under a completely different industrial paradigm than we understood. They're not building individual carriers as unique vessels. They're manufacturing them as production units. He pulled out photographs taken by a German military attaché who had toured American shipyards before Germany declared war on the United States. The images showed something that Japanese naval planners had never conceived: assembly line construction of aircraft carrier components. Look at this. Genda spread the photographs across the desk. Newport News Shipbuilding has ways, slipways, capable of laying down multiple carriers simultaneously. They're using prefabricated sections manufactured in different facilities, then assembled at the shipyard. The electrical systems are standardized. The propulsion plants are standardized. Even the galley equipment is standardized. Like building automobiles, Naito said quietly. Exactly like building automobiles. Henry Ford's assembly line, applied to warship construction. Genda tapped another photograph. This is the Willow Run plant in Michigan. They're building B-24 Liberator bombers. Each aircraft has over 1 million parts, at a rate of 1 every 63 minutes. The same principles that allow that production rate are being applied to carrier construction. Watanabe leaned forward, studying the images. How many shipyards are building Essex-Class carriers? 6 major yards on the East Coast. Newport News has 3 under construction simultaneously. Brooklyn Navy Yard has 5 on order. Philadelphia, Norfolk, Quincy, all building carriers on multiple slipways. Genda pulled out a chart showing American shipyard capacity. And this is what we failed to understand in 1941. American shipyards were expanding even before Pearl Harbor. The Two-Ocean Navy Act appropriated funds for massive shipyard expansion. By the time we attacked Pearl Harbor, they'd already laid the industrial foundation for this production surge. Yamamoto-san knew, Watanabe said. He tried to tell the Naval General Staff. I heard him argue in planning meetings before Pearl Harbor. He said if we didn't win decisively in 6 months, American industrial capacity would overwhelm us. He studied at Harvard, Genda said. He served as naval attaché in Washington. He'd seen American automobile factories, steel mills, oil refineries. He understood what we were challenging. Genda's voice dropped. And now he's dead, shot down because American cryptographers broke our codes, and American fighters had the range to intercept him. More evidence of their industrial advantages. Unlimited fuel for training flights that produce excellent pilots. Unlimited resources for signals intelligence. Unlimited everything. Naito had been silent during this exchange, but now he spoke carefully. Sir Chusa-sama, what happens when the Americans have 15 fleet carriers operational? 20. What happens to our defensive perimeter? Genda walked back to the wall map. His finger traced the line of islands that constituted Japan's outer defensive ring. The Marshalls, the Marianas, the Carolines, the Philippines. Each Essex-Class carrier can operate 90 to 100 aircraft. 15 carriers means 1,300 to 1,500 carrier aircraft, not counting land-based aircraft. They'll establish air superiority over any objective they choose, then destroy our ships attempting to reinforce. Island hopping, Watanabe said. Yes, they'll bypass strongly defended positions, seize lightly defended islands, build airfields, and use those bases to isolate the bypassed positions. Each Essex-class carrier becomes a mobile airfield that can support an amphibious invasion anywhere we can't concentrate sufficient force to oppose them. And we can't be strong everywhere. Genda's finger moved across the map, tracing the inevitable American advance. They'll come through the Gilberts first, Tarawa, Makin, then the Marshalls, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, then the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. From the Marianas, their new B-29 bombers can reach the home islands, and backing every operation will be 4, 5, 6 Essex-class carriers, providing air cover that we simply cannot match. The three officers stood in silence, staring at the map that suddenly looked less like an empire and more like a target. The humidity pressed in, making breathing difficult. Outside, tropical birds called from the palm trees that surrounded the harbor, where Japan's remaining carriers swung at anchor, waiting for orders that would send them against an enemy that grew stronger every day. "There's one more thing," Watanabe said. He pulled out a decoded American radio message from his briefcase. This was intercepted 3 days ago from Hawaii. It's addressed to all American carrier commanding officers, current and prospective. He read aloud. USS Hancock CV-19, successfully completed builder's trials ahead of schedule. Expected commissioning April 1944. USS Bennington CV-20 launched. Expected commissioning August 1944. USS Boxer CV-21 launched. Expected commissioning April 1944. Watanabe looked up. It continues for 6 more vessels. Genda sat down slowly, suddenly feeling every one of his 43 years. He'd been one of the finest aviators in the Imperial Japanese Navy, a pioneer of carrier tactics, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack plan. He'd believed in naval aviation when most of the Navy worshipped battleships. He'd trained his pilots to the highest standards, developed doctrine for massed carrier strikes, proved that aircraft carriers were the future of naval warfare, and now that future was burying Japan under an avalanche of American steel. "What do we tell the Admiral?" Naito asked quietly. Genda stared at the chart showing American carrier positions, at the neat rows of names that multiplied with each intelligence update. Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Franklin, Ticonderoga, Randolph, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Wasp. More names waiting to be assigned to hulls under construction. More ceremonies in American shipyards launching vessels that would hunt Japanese ships across the Pacific. What none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined that humid morning in Truk Lagoon, was that the numbers they were looking at, frightening as they appeared, actually understated the true scope of American naval expansion. Along with the Essex-class fleet carriers, American shipyards were constructing 9 Independence-class light carriers, over 100 escort carriers, and scores of supporting vessels. The industrial machine that had once built automobiles and refrigerators had pivoted entirely to war production, and its output exceeded not just Japanese capacity, but Japanese comprehension. "Tell him the truth," Genda finally said. "Tell him we sank 4 American carriers in 1942. Tell him America has commissioned 8 Essex-Class carriers in response, with 14 more expected by war's end. Tell him that we're fighting an enemy who builds fleet carriers faster than we build destroyers. He looked at Watanabe. And tell him that Yamamoto was right. We should have negotiated peace in 1942 when we still had carriers to negotiate with. The words hung in the humid air of the intelligence center, spoken aloud for the first time what many Japanese naval officers now understood, but none dared say. The war was lost. It had been lost the moment American shipyards began launching Essex-Class carriers at intervals measured in weeks rather than years. The mathematics were inescapable. The conclusion was inevitable. Japan had won the battles of 1942. America was winning the Industrial War of 1943. And by 1944, those Essex-Class carriers would own the Pacific. The story of how America came to build 24 Essex-Class carriers in less than 4 years began not in 1941, but in a Washington conference room in May 1938, when Franklin Roosevelt signed the Naval Expansion Act. The legislation authorized construction of a 2-ocean navy capable of simultaneous operations in both the Atlantic and Pacific. Among the authorized vessels were 11 aircraft carriers, a number that would seem modest compared to what actually emerged from American shipyards once the war began. Captain Mark Mitcher, who would later command carrier task forces that devastated the Japanese fleet, sat in the Bureau of Ships office in Washington in June 1939, reviewing preliminary designs for what would become the Essex-Class. The Navy's requirements were ambitious: a carrier larger than the Yorktown class, capable of operating more aircraft, with better damage control and armor protection, but still able to transit the Panama Canal. 27,000 tons standard displacement. Mitcher read from the actual specifications. That's 9,000 tons heavier than Yorktown. Can we build them fast enough? Commander James Russell, the Bureau's carrier design specialist, spread blueprints across the conference table. If we build them the old way, each carrier as a unique vessel with custom fittings, then no. But if we standardize everything, he tapped the drawings. Look at this. Same propulsion plant for every vessel, same electrical systems, same elevator designs, same aircraft catapults. We make one set of detailed engineering drawings. Then every shipyard uses identical specifications. Like building automobiles, Mitcher said. Exactly like building automobiles. Henry Ford proved you can manufacture complex machines quickly if you standardize components and use assembly line techniques. Russell pulled out production schedules. Newport News Shipbuilding estimates they can complete an Essex-Class carrier in 18 months from keel laying to commissioning. If we stagger construction across multiple yards, we could have a new fleet carrier every 4 to 6 weeks once production reaches peak efficiency. Mitcher studied the numbers with the skepticism of a man who'd watched naval construction programs fail to meet promised schedules. And if war comes, then we accelerate everything. The 2-Ocean Navy Act has already appropriated funds for massive shipyard expansion. We're adding building ways, installing new cranes, training thousands of workers. The industrial capacity will be there when we need it. What neither officer could have predicted that afternoon in 1939 was just how desperately that capacity would be needed, or how quickly American industry would exceed even the most optimistic projections. The design that emerged from those planning sessions represented the culmination of American carrier aviation experience from the 1920s and 1930s. Where earlier carriers had been converted from battleship or battlecruiser hulls, the Essex-Class was purpose-built from the keel up as an aircraft carrier. The design incorporated lessons learned from Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, which were themselves considered highly successful. At the Norfolk Navy Yard in November 1940, Master Chief Shipfitter Joseph McKinney walked the length of the keel being laid for CV-11, which would eventually be named Intrepid. The massive steel members stretched 870 feet, longer than any American carrier yet built. McKinney had worked on carrier construction since the 1920s, when Lexington and Saratoga were converted from battlecruiser hulls. "This one's different," he told the junior shipfitters under his supervision. "Everything about her is bigger. Flight deck is 108 feet wide at the widest point. Hangar deck can hold more aircraft than Yorktown's entire air group. And look at this armor scheme." He pointed to the blueprints showing the protective plating. Belt armor along the waterline, armored deck protecting the machinery spaces, reinforced bulkheads around the magazines. "She's built to take punishment and keep fighting." The designers studied what happened to Yorktown at Coral Sea. Ship was badly damaged but stayed in the fight. The Essex-Class takes those lessons and builds them into every frame. The construction of CV-9, the lead ship USS Essex, began at Newport News Shipbuilding on April 28, 1941, more than 7 months before Pearl Harbor. The shipyard, which had built Yorktown and Enterprise, approached the new carrier with refined techniques developed through experience. Thomas Waters, the yard superintendent, implemented construction methods that would later be recognized as revolutionary. Prefabricated sections were built in different parts of the yard, then lifted into place by massive cranes. Electrical systems were pre-wired in modules that could be installed as complete units. Propulsion machinery, 4 Westinghouse-geared turbines producing 150,000 shaft horsepower, was manufactured to exact specifications that allowed installation without custom fitting. "We're building this ship in pieces," Waters explained to a visiting naval inspector in August 1941. "Then assembling the pieces like a giant puzzle. Every pipe, every wire, every structural member is manufactured to precise specifications. If a section doesn't fit, we don't modify the ship. We reject the section and demand a replacement built correctly." The inspector, a veteran of naval construction who'd overseen battleship building in the 1920s, was skeptical. That level of precision across thousands of components? The tolerances required? American industry can achieve tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch for automobile engines produced by the millions, Waters replied. "A carrier has more parts than a car, but the principle is the same. Standardization, quality control, assembly line discipline applied to shipbuilding." The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, transformed American carrier construction from ambitious to desperate. The Pacific Fleet's battleship force lay crippled in the mud of Pearl Harbor. The 3 carriers that escaped destruction, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, suddenly bore the entire weight of America's naval response in the Pacific. At the White House, Roosevelt met with Navy Secretary Frank Knox and Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold Stark 3 days after Pearl Harbor. The president's question was blunt. How fast can we replace our carrier strength? Stark laid out the construction schedule. Essex will commission late 1942, CV-10, which we're naming Yorktown to replace the carrier we expect to lose, should commission early 1943. After that, 1 carrier every 4 to 6 weeks if the shipyards meet schedule. Accelerate it, Roosevelt ordered. Whatever resources the shipyards need, steel, workers, priority for components, they get it. I want carriers in the Pacific as fast as American industry can build them. The president's directive triggered a transformation in American shipbuilding that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. Workers flooded into coastal cities. Women who'd never held industrial jobs learned to weld, rivet, and wire electrical systems. Shipyards operated 3 shifts around the clock, their arc welders creating cascades of sparks visible for miles. At Newport News, the Essex construction accelerated dramatically. Thomas Waters stood on the scaffolding surrounding the carrier's hull in January 1942, watching as 3 shifts of workers, many of them women, many of them fresh from training programs measured in weeks rather than months, assembled sections with efficiency that improved daily. "How many workers on the ship right now?" asked Commander William Kirk, the Navy's on-site supervisor. Waters checked his clipboard. 4,200 on this shift, another 4,000 coming on in 6 hours. We're running 3 8-hour shifts with full crews. If we need overtime, we can go to 4-hour shifts and double the workforce. And quality? Watch. Waters pointed to a section of hull plating being positioned by crane. 6 welders moved in simultaneously, their torches creating precise seams that would later be X-rayed for defects. Those women there. The redhead is Martha Crowley. The brunette is Sarah Chen. 6 weeks ago, neither had ever held a welding torch. Now they're making welds that meet naval specifications for critical hull structures. Kirk studied the scene with amazement. How? Standardized training. Quality inspectors at every stage. Any defect caught immediately and corrected. And something else. They know what they're building matters. Every worker here has a son or husband or brother in the service. They know these carriers will fight the Japanese. That motivation produces quality that regulations alone can't achieve. The Essex launched on July 31, 1942, just 15 months after her keel was laid. Secretary Knox attended the ceremony, giving a speech that newspapers across America reprinted. This carrier represents American industrial might transformed into naval power. She is the first of many. Each month will bring new carriers down the ways. The Imperial Japanese Navy sank our carriers at Coral Sea and Midway, thinking they'd crippled our naval aviation. They're about to learn what American production capacity means. What made the Essex-Class particularly formidable was not just their numbers, but their design improvements over earlier carriers. The flight deck, at 862 feet long and 108 feet wide at its broadest point, provided more space for aircraft operations than any American carrier yet built. The hangar deck below could accommodate aircraft in what the designers called the Sunday Punch configuration. 36 fighters, 36 dive bombers, and 18 torpedo bombers, with additional aircraft stored on the flight deck. Lieutenant Commander John Crommelin, assigned as the air operations officer for the Essex during her fitting-out period in late 1942, walked the flight deck with Captain Donald Duncan, the carrier's first commanding officer. The sheer size impressed both men. "We can launch a full deck load strike of 60-plus aircraft," Crommelin noted, "then recover them and prepare a second strike while the first is still en route to the target. With proper coordination, we can maintain continuous offensive operations." Duncan nodded. "And the defensive systems?" 12 5-inch dual-purpose guns in single mounts, arranged for maximum sky coverage. 32 40mm Bofors in quadruple mounts. 46 20mm Oerlikons. The fire control systems use radar to direct the 5-inch guns, and the 40s have new computing gun sights. Any Japanese aircraft that gets through the combat air patrol faces a wall of steel. They walked to the island structure, where the ship's radar antennae sprouted like metal flowers. The SK air search radar could detect aircraft at 100 miles. The SG surface search radar could find ships beyond the horizon. Fighter direction officers would use this information to vector combat air patrols against incoming threats, creating a defensive system unprecedented in naval warfare. "The Japanese don't have anything like this integrated approach," Duncan said. "They rely on visual observation and pilot initiative. We're weaponizing information itself." The Essex commissioned on December 31, 1942, exactly 12 months and 8 days after Pearl Harbor. Her crew numbered 3,248 officers and men, more than any American carrier yet commissioned. As she departed Norfolk for her shakedown cruise, 5 more Essex-Class carriers were under construction on nearby slipways, their hulls rising like steel cathedrals from the building ways. At the Brooklyn Navy Yard, workers were laying the keel for CV-16, which would be named Lexington to honor the carrier lost at Coral Sea. At Philadelphia, CV-14 Ticonderoga was taking shape. At Quincy, Massachusetts, CV-18 Wasp represented a symbolic resurrection of another lost carrier. Each shipyard had refined construction techniques, reducing build times even as they increased quality. The standardization that made this production possible extended beyond the ships themselves to their aircraft and equipment. Every Essex-class carrier received identical catapults manufactured by a single contractor. Every radar set was built to the same specifications. Every 5-inch gun mount was interchangeable. This meant spare parts could be transferred between ships, maintenance crews could move between carriers without retraining, and the entire class operated as a unified system rather than individual vessels. Captain Joseph Clark, who would later command Yorktown, CV-10, and then Hornet, CV-12, visited multiple carriers during their construction in 1943. He recognized immediately how standardization multiplied American advantages. "A pilot trained on Essex can operate from Yorktown without adjustment," he noted in his diary. "A mechanic from Intrepid can repair aircraft on Lexington using familiar tools and procedures. We're creating not individual carriers, but a carrier fleet that functions as an integrated weapon system." The industrial effort required to maintain Essex-class production staggered even those familiar with American capacity. Each carrier required 30,000 tons of steel, 8 miles of electrical wiring, thousands of electric motors, millions of rivets, and countless specialized components. The Westinghouse turbines alone required precision machining of components weighing hundreds of tons. Yet American factories delivered these components on schedule month after month, feeding shipyards that never slowed their construction pace. In Truk Lagoon, Commander Genda received monthly intelligence updates on American carrier construction. Each report brought news of another launching, another commissioning, another Essex-class carrier joining the Pacific Fleet. By August 1943, when his headache drove him to the intelligence center that morning, 7 Essex-class carriers had been commissioned. By war's end, that number would reach 14, with 10 more completed shortly after Japan's surrender. What Genda couldn't know, studying his charts in the tropical heat, was that American shipyard workers were already solving problems that would have required months or years in Japanese yards. When bomb damage from a kamikaze attack later struck Franklin, CV-13, American repair crews would restore her to operational status in weeks. When Bunker Hill suffered devastating kamikaze hits that killed nearly 400 men, she would steam back to port under her own power. Her damage control parties fighting fires that would have sunk earlier carriers. The Essex-class represented more than ships. They embodied American industrial philosophy, mass production of standardized, high-quality systems that could be manufactured quickly, repaired easily, and operated effectively by crews trained to consistent standards. Where Japanese carriers were built as unique vessels requiring specialized parts and custom maintenance, Essex-class carriers were built as production units that shared components, procedures, and doctrine. By early 1944, The question in the Pacific was no longer whether America could build enough carriers, but what Japan could do to stop the tide of Essex-Class vessels that now dominated every major engagement. The answer, as Japanese commanders were learning, was nothing. You couldn't sink carriers faster than American shipyards could replace them. You couldn't train pilots faster than American training programs could produce them. You couldn't match the industrial capacity of a nation that had transformed the assembly line techniques of automobile production into naval warfare's most powerful weapon system. The mathematics were merciless. The conclusion was inevitable, and every Essex-class carrier that joined the fleet brought that conclusion one step closer. June 19th, 1944, at 08:40 hours, 23,000 feet above the Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Zenji Abe tightened his grip on the control stick of his Nakajima B-6N Tenzan torpedo bomber, scanning the horizon through the oil-smeared windscreen of his aircraft. Behind him, radioman Petty Officer Hiroshi Tanaka called out positions of the other aircraft in their formation. 27 torpedo bombers from the carrier Taiho, part of a massive strike force of 373 aircraft, launched at dawn to destroy the American invasion fleet off Saipan. "Beautiful morning for it," Abe transmitted to his wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Takeo Suzuki. "Clear visibility, light winds. The Americans won't see us coming until we're in our attack runs." What Abe didn't know, what none of the Japanese pilots knew as they droned eastward in their neat formations, was that American radar operators on Task Force 58 had detected their approach 140 miles out. Fighter directors were already vectoring combat air patrols to intercept. And arrayed below in a defensive formation that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier were 15 American aircraft carriers, 7 of them Essex-class fleet carriers, each one launching fighters that would turn this attack into what American pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Abe checked his fuel gauge and calculated ranges. Taiho had launched his formation at 08:30 hours from a position approximately 300 miles west of the American fleet. His B-6N carried one Type 91 aerial torpedo, 2,100 pounds of destruction that could crack open a carrier's hull if he could just get close enough to release it. Intelligence briefings had indicated the Americans had 4 to 6 carriers in the area. A large force, certainly, but nothing the combined fleet couldn't handle. The radio man's voice crackled through the intercom. "Urgent now." "Lieutenant, I'm picking up multiple contacts on the radio. Many transmissions. American fighter direction channels are very active." "How many?" "I cannot count them, sir. The frequencies are saturated." Abe felt his stomach tighten. Heavy radio traffic meant many fighters, many controllers, many carriers. But he pushed the concern aside. They were committed now. 373 aircraft couldn't simply turn around without attacking. Admiral Ozawa had staked everything on this massive strike, the largest carrier-based air attack since Pearl Harbor. At 09:36 hours, Abe saw them. Not 4 carriers, not 6 carriers. The horizon ahead showed what looked like an entire city floating on the Pacific. 15 aircraft carriers arranged in circular formations, each group surrounded by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in defensive screens that bristled with anti-aircraft guns. The sheer scale of it stopped his breath. "Tanaka," Abe said carefully, "how many carriers do you count?" Silence from the rear cockpit as the radio man looked past Abe's shoulder at the fleet below. Then, in a voice that carried disbelief, "I count 11. No, 13. Lieutenant, there are more behind those. I count 15 American carriers." 15 carriers. The number seemed impossible. Japan's entire mobile fleet possessed 9 carriers, and 3 of those were light carriers. The Americans had fielded 15 carriers for a single operation, and Abe's intelligence briefings had said 4 to 6. "All aircraft," the strike commander's voice came over the radio. "Proceed to attack as briefed. Torpedo bombers will target the nearest carrier group. Dive bombers will—" The transmission ended in static. Abe never learned what the dive bombers were supposed to do, because at that moment, the American fighters arrived. They came from above and ahead, from the sides, from angles Abe hadn't known were possible. Not the 20 or 30 fighters he'd expected, but wave after wave of Grumman F-6F Hellcats, their dark blue paint making them nearly invisible against the sky until they were already firing. The distinctive sound of 650 caliber machine guns opening up simultaneously, a sound like ripping canvas but louder, deeper, more terrible, filled the air. The first Japanese aircraft Abe saw die was a Zero fighter that had been providing their escort. The Mitsubishi fighter simply came apart in mid-air, torn into fragments by a single firing pass from a Hellcat that appeared, killed, and vanished back into the sky so quickly, Abe barely registered its presence. The Zero's pilot, a man Abe had known since flight training, didn't even have time to transmit before his aircraft became burning debris falling toward the ocean. "Break! Break!" Voices screamed over the radio. "Fighters everywhere! We're taking heavy losses!" Abe threw his torpedo bomber into a diving turn, trying to gain speed and lose altitude where the heavy American fighters would be less maneuverable. His B-6N, laden with its torpedo, responded sluggishly. Behind him, Tanaka's machine gun chattered uselessly at Hellcats that flashed past at speeds his bullets could never match. 2 more torpedo bombers from his formation exploded, then 3 dive bombers, then a section of Zeros. The American fighters weren't just numerous, they were coordinated, working in pairs and divisions, high cover protecting low cover, each engagement seemingly choreographed to maximize killing efficiency while minimizing their own exposure. "How are there so many?" Suzuki's panicked voice came over the radio. "Intelligence said—" His transmission cut off as his aircraft took hits from a Hellcat that had dropped from above. Abe watched his wingman's bomber trail smoke and begin the long spiral toward the ocean. Suzuki's voice never returned to the radio. Abe pressed on. His training, his duty, his oath to the Emperor demanded he press the attack. Below him, the American carriers continued their operations as if the massive Japanese strike force didn't exist. He could see aircraft launching and recovering, deck crews moving with practiced efficiency, and nowhere any sign of panic or confusion. Through a gap in the swirling dogfights, Abe identified his target, one of the large carriers in the nearest defensive circle. Her flight deck stretched nearly 3 football fields. Her island bristled with radar antennae, and her escorts threw up a curtain of anti-aircraft fire that seemed to create a solid wall of explosions between the attackers and their target. "That one," Abe told Tanaka, pointing at the carrier. "We're going in." "Hi, Lieutenant." Abe pushed the bomber's nose down, beginning his torpedo run from 8,000 feet. The B-6N picked up speed, the engine howling as the airspeed indicator climbed. His plan was simple: dive to gain speed, level out at 200 feet, release the torpedo at 1,000 yards, then climb and escape while the weapon ran toward the target. It was a plan that had worked in training exercises hundreds of times. Against the Americans in the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, it lasted approximately 45 seconds. At 6,000 feet, a Hellcat found him. The American fighter pilot, Abe would never know his name, was Ensign Robert Duncan from Yorktown's VF-1 Squadron, positioned perfectly, leading his target by exactly the right amount, and pressed his trigger. 6 streams of 50 caliber bullets converged on the B-6N's engine cowling. The Nakajima 1850 horsepower radial engine, hit by at least 20 armor-piercing incendiary rounds, disintegrated. Oil sprayed across the windscreen, blinding Abe. The aircraft shuddered as if struck by a massive fist. Behind him, Tanaka screamed, once, then went silent as bullets tore through the aircraft's thin aluminum skin. Abe fought the controls, trying to maintain his dive angle even as the engine seized and black smoke poured from the cowling. His torpedo was still attached. If he could just get close enough, if he could release it before the aircraft broke apart, maybe the mission wouldn't be a complete failure. At 4,000 feet, his elevator controls went slack. Duncan's bullets had severed the control cables. The B-6N's nose dropped more steeply, the dive accelerating beyond what the airframe could handle. At 2,000 feet, Abe accepted he was going to die. His hands moved automatically, reaching for the torpedo release even though he was still miles from proper attack position. Better to drop it now and hope for a miracle than die with it still attached. The torpedo released at 1,800 feet, far too high and far too far from the target. It hit the water at an angle that snapped its stabilizing fins, sending it tumbling uselessly into the depths. Abe never saw this. His aircraft continued its death dive, the ocean rushing up at terminal velocity. At the last moment, with the water filling his vision and the smoke in his lungs and the certain knowledge that he'd failed his emperor and his comrades, Abe pulled the canopy release and tried to bail out. The slipstream tore him from the cockpit, breaking his left arm and knocking him unconscious before his parachute could deploy. He woke in the water, floating in his life vest, the sun bright and hot on his face. Around him, the ocean was filled with debris, pieces of aircraft, floating life rafts, oil slicks burning with yellow flames. Other Japanese pilots floated nearby, some calling out to each other, others silent and still. From his position in the water, Abe watched the rest of the attack. Watched as the remaining torpedo bombers tried to penetrate the screen of fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Watched as they died, one after another, torn apart by Hellcats or blown out of the sky by the massed firepower of the American fleet. Not one torpedo hit any carrier. Not one dive bomber penetrated to drop altitude. Of the 373 aircraft launched that morning, only 27 would return to the mobile fleet. An American destroyer, USS Cowell, found Abe floating 3 hours later. The sailors who pulled him from the water spoke no Japanese, but their actions were gentle, professional. They gave him water, treated his broken arm, removed his wet clothing, and replaced it with dry overalls marked with a large PW on the back. On Cowell's bridge, Abe stood under guard, watching the American fleet continue operations. He counted the carriers again, 15, and even as he counted, aircraft launched and recovered in a continuous cycle that never paused. Hellcats taking off, Hellcats landing, dive bombers arming for strikes, torpedo bombers loading weapons. The orchestration was perfect, mechanical, unstoppable. The destroyer's captain, Lieutenant Commander Charles Howell, spoke some Japanese learned during a pre-war posting to Tokyo. He approached Abe on the bridge, offering a cigarette. "You're from Taiho?" Howell asked in careful Japanese. Abe nodded, accepting the cigarette. Geneva Convention said he had to provide name, rank, and serial number. Nothing more. But Howell's next question wasn't military intelligence. "Did you see how many carriers we have?" Abe looked at the captain, trying to read whether this was interrogation technique or genuine curiosity. Howell's face showed only professional interest, maybe even sympathy. 15, Abe said quietly. I counted 15 fleet carriers. That's correct. 7 are Essex-Class. Those are the big ones with the long flight decks. 8 are Independence-class light carriers, converted from cruiser hulls. And that's just Task Force 58. We have more carriers supporting operations elsewhere. The casual way Howell delivered this information, not as boast, but as simple fact, struck Abe harder than his injuries. The captain wasn't trying to intimidate him. He was just stating reality. How? Abe asked. The war has been 3 years. How do you have so many carriers? Howell drew on his own cigarette, considering the question. Around them, the American fleet steamed in perfect formation, the carriers' islands showing fresh paint and new radar equipment. We build them, he said simply. Newport News Shipbuilding launched Essex-Class No. 14 last month. No. 15 is in fitting out. No. 16 is under construction. And those are just the fleet carriers. Abe watched as one of the Essex-Class carriers, he would learn later it was Lexington, recovered aircraft from what must have been the 6th or 7th strike of the day. The deck crews moved with precision born of constant practice, guiding fighters to precise spots, folding wings, pushing aircraft onto elevators that whisked them below to the hangar deck. Within minutes, the flight deck was clear and launching another strike. Taiho carried 63 aircraft, Abe said. Each of your Essex-class carriers operates 90 to 100 aircraft. 7 Essex-class carriers means... He did the mathematics that every surviving Japanese aviator would do in the coming hours. 700 aircraft, plus the light carriers. 800 aircraft total. We attacked with 373, and how many survived? Howell consulted a message pad. Our combat air patrols reported splashing 346 enemy aircraft. That number might be inflated by duplicate claims, but probably not by much. 346 destroyed out of 373 launched, a loss rate of 93%. Abe had watched good pilots die, men he'd trained with, men who'd survived battles from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea. They died not because they lacked skill or courage, but because American fighters outnumbered them 10 to 1. Because American radar detected them 100 miles away. Because American industry produced carriers faster than Japanese shipyards could build destroyers. Your Admiral Yamamoto, Howell said, is said to have warned your government about American industrial capacity. Did anyone listen? He studied at Harvard, Abe replied. He served in Washington. He understood. But after Pearl Harbor, after our victories in 1942, he trailed off. What was the point of explaining Japanese assumptions now? The war had proven all those assumptions catastrophically wrong. That night, confined in a temporary holding area on Cowell's main deck, Abe lay awake listening to the sounds of the American fleet. Radar antennae rotating constantly. Radio chatter coordinating operations across dozens of ships. Aircraft engines starting for night combat air patrols, something Japanese carriers couldn't sustain because of limited aircraft, limited fuel, limited everything. Other prisoners were with him, survivors pulled from the water by various American ships. A Zero pilot named Matsuda had been shot down on his 3rd combat sortie. He'd trained for 2 years before the war, become an ace with 5 kills. The Hellcat that killed his aircraft had been piloted by an American who'd learned to fly just 18 months ago, his instructor had told him before he died. 18 months from civilian to combat pilot. Japan's training pipeline, shattered by losses, now produced pilots with 100 hours of flight time entering combat against Americans with 300 hours. "We can't win this," Matsuda said to the darkness. "Even if every one of us shoots down 10 Americans, they'll build 20 more aircraft to replace them. Even if we sink 5 of their carriers, they'll commission 10 more." No one argued with him. The mathematics were too obvious, the reality too clear. Everyone in that holding area had seen 15 American carriers, had watched American fighters swarm like angry hornets, had observed an industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Japan could match. 3 days later, on June 22nd, Abe was transferred to a larger ship for transport to Pearl Harbor and eventual movement to a POW camp in the United States. As he climbed aboard USS Baltimore, a heavy cruiser serving as Admiral Spruance's flagship, he looked back at the task force one last time. 7 Essex-Class carriers steamed in formation, their flight decks busy with operations even 3 days after the battle. Fresh aircraft had replaced losses, if the Americans had suffered any losses, which Abe doubted. Fresh pilots rotated in from training commands that graduated thousands annually. Fresh fuel, fresh ammunition, fresh everything. Standing at Baltimore's rail, waiting to be taken below, Abe watched USS Lexington launch a strike. 30 aircraft lifted from her deck in perfect sequence, forming up overhead before setting course westward toward Japanese positions. The launch took 11 minutes. Before the last aircraft cleared the deck, recovery operations began for planes returning from an earlier strike. "Remarkable, isn't it?" An American officer had appeared beside him, speaking in Japanese. The man wore the insignia of a Navy commander and the breast wings of a naval aviator. "I'm Commander Ford, from Admiral Spruance's staff. I'm told you're a naval aviator also." Abe nodded warily. "I wanted to tell you something," Ford continued. "What you saw out there, the 15 carriers, the fighters, the coordination, that's not our full strength. That's one task force. We have 3 more task forces of similar size operating in the Pacific, and more carriers commissioning every month." "Why tell me this?" Abe asked. "Because you'll be in a POW camp with other Japanese naval officers. Some of them will talk about fighting to the last man, about eventual victory. I want you to tell them what you saw. Tell them about the 15 carriers. Tell them about the fighters that destroyed your attack. Tell them that America is building Essex-Class carriers at a rate of 1 every 6 weeks. Ford paused, watching as Lexington completed her launch and immediately began recovering aircraft. Tell them that Admiral Yamamoto was right. Tell them this war ended the day America's shipyards started launching Essex-Class carriers. Everything since has just been mathematics. Abe was taken below then, confined with other prisoners in a secure compartment. But Ford's words stayed with him, echoing through the coming months in the POW camp, through the interrogations and the interviews and the long hours of contemplating how completely Japan's assumptions had failed. 15 carriers at the Philippine Sea, 4 more task forces in the Pacific, production running at 1 carrier every 6 weeks. The numbers told a story more devastating than any battle report. Japan had won tactical victories in 1942. America had won the Industrial War in 1943. By 1944, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The only question remaining was how long Japan would take to accept what Lieutenant Zenji Abe had learned, floating in the Philippine Sea, watching an entire empire's assumptions disintegrate under the weight of American industrial mathematics. The lesson Lieutenant Abe learned at the Philippine Sea spread through the Imperial Japanese Navy like a contagion of truth. Officers who dismissed American industrial capacity as propaganda now confronted reports from multiple battles showing the same impossible numbers. Essex-Class carriers appeared everywhere simultaneously. In the Marianas, off the Philippines, supporting amphibious landings that seized island after island. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita received his education in American carrier strength on October 25, 1944, during the battle off Samar, when his center force of 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers encountered what he believed was a lightly defended escort carrier group. What should have been a massacre of small carriers turned into confusion when American pilots from those escort carriers fought with such ferocity that Kurita briefly believed he'd stumbled into a trap involving Essex-Class fleet carriers. Standing on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, Kurita watched shell splashes bracket the small American carriers as they desperately tried to escape. His heavy cruisers were closing, their 8-inch guns finding the range. Victory seemed certain. Then the reports started flooding in from his lookouts. Many aircraft approaching from the east, fleet carrier types. Large carrier formation detected on radar, distance 70 kilometers. Air attack imminent. The contacts were real. Task Force 38 had sortied from Ulithi, and 3 groups of Essex-Class carriers were racing north to intercept Kurita's force. What Kurita didn't know was that they were still hours away. But the knowledge that multiple Essex-Class carriers were converging on his position, combined with the savage resistance from the escort carrier's aircraft, convinced him he was sailing into an ambush. At 0911 hours, with victory nearly in his grasp, Kurita ordered his forces to retire. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi, protested. "Admiral, we have them. The carriers are vulnerable. Our battleships can destroy them before the fleet carriers arrive." "And then what?" Kurita snapped. "We sink 3 escort carriers and lose the center force to American fleet carrier strikes? Look at what happened in the Philippine Sea. 300 aircraft destroyed in one day. Do you think they won't do the same to us?" Koyanagi had no answer. Everyone in the Japanese Navy knew the Philippine Sea statistics. Everyone understood what 15 American carriers meant for any Japanese surface force operating within 300 miles of an American carrier group. "We retire," Kurita repeated. "If we stay, we die." The decision to withdraw at Samar, later controversial in Japanese naval circles, exemplified how completely the Essex-Class carriers had changed Pacific naval warfare. Japanese commanders now had to factor in the assumption that multiple American fleet carriers were always within striking range. Even when they weren't, the psychological impact of knowing they could be was enough to alter tactical decisions. Captain Toshikazu Omai, serving on Kurita's staff during Leyte Gulf, would write in his post-war memoir, "The Americans didn't need to be present everywhere. The mere possibility of Essex-Class carriers arriving forced us to abandon operations we might otherwise have pressed. We were fighting ghosts as much as actual ships." By November 1944, the Japanese Navy had been reduced to desperate measures. The conventional air power that had dominated the Pacific in 1942 was gone, destroyed by American fighters flying from carriers that seemed to multiply like cells under a microscope. In its place came the kamikazes, suicide attackers who would use their aircraft as weapons, trading 1 pilot and 1 plane for, hopefully, 1 American ship. The first organized kamikaze attacks came on October 25th, the same day as Samar. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, had organized 26 A6M-0 fighters into special attack units. At 10:49 hours, 5 kamikazes dove on escort carrier USS St. Lo. 4 missed. The 5th struck home, its bomb-laden aircraft crashing through the flight deck and detonating in the hangar bay among fueled and armed aircraft. St. Lo sank 30 minutes later. Japanese commanders, desperate for any success against American naval power, seized on the kamikaze as their salvation. If conventional attacks couldn't penetrate American defenses, perhaps suicide tactics could overwhelm them through sheer determination. Essex-Class carriers, with their heavy air complements and strong anti-aircraft defenses, became priority targets. On November 25, 1944, kamikaze attackers found the Essex-Class carriers of Task, Group 38.2 operating off Luzon. 4 attackers penetrated the combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire. 2 targeted USS Intrepid, the carrier Abe had seen launching strikes at the Philippine Sea. The first kamikaze struck Intrepid's flight deck near the island, the explosion killing 10 men and wounding 6. The second crashed into the port gun gallery seconds later, its bomb exploding among the 20mm gun crews. 69 men died in total. Commander Joseph Bolger, Intrepid's executive officer, raced to the damage control central as fire alarms shrieked throughout the ship. Smoke billowed from the holes in the flight deck. Fuel fires burned in the gun galleries. The carrier shuddered as explosions rocked the structure. "Get me a report!" Bolger shouted over the noise. "How bad is it?" Lieutenant Commander Frank Burdine, the damage control officer, coordinated reports from repair parties throughout the ship. His voice, when he replied, carried professional calm despite the chaos. 2 direct hits, both on the flight deck and superstructure. Fires in 4 compartments. Magazine flooding stations report no flooding needed. Fires haven't reached ammunition stores. Port gallery gun crews suffered casualties, but starboard batteries are operational. Flight deck hold, but the structural members are intact. Can we conduct flight operations? Not immediately, sir. We need to extinguish the fires and patch the flight deck holes. But... Burdine checked his calculations. We can have a temporary deck ready in 2 hours. Full operations in 4 hours. Bolger stared at his damage control officer in disbelief. 4 hours? We just took 2 kamikazes through the flight deck. Sir, the Essex-Class was designed for this. The armored flight deck isn't as thick as the British carriers, but the structural design compartmentalizes damage. The fires can't spread easily because of the bulkheads. The flight deck damage is localized. We can work around it. And they did. At 15:20 hours, less than 4 hours after the kamikaze hits, Intrepid recovered aircraft from a strike that had launched before the attack. By 1700 hours, she was launching her own strikes again. The repair crews had welded steel plates over the holes, rigged temporary lighting, and cleared debris with an efficiency that seemed impossible to anyone not familiar with American damage control doctrine. That efficiency was repeated across the Essex-Class throughout the final year of the war. USS Franklin took a kamikaze hit on October 30, 1944. She was back in action within days. USS Lexington absorbed a kamikaze on November 5th. Her crew fought the fires, patched the damage, and resumed operations the same day. USS Essex herself took a kamikaze strike on November 25th, the same attack that hit Intrepid, killing 15 and wounding 44. She retired briefly for repairs, then returned to the battle line. The kamikaze's success rate improved as Japanese pilots grew more desperate and American defenses faced increasingly difficult challenges. But the fundamental mathematics hadn't changed. For every Essex-Class carrier damaged, 2 more were available to take her place. For every carrier sent back to Pearl Harbor or the West Coast for repairs, another fresh carrier arrived from the States with a fully trained air group eager for combat. Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet charged with kamikaze operations from Kyushu, Recorded in his diary the growing frustration of trading pilot lives for temporary damage. We strike them again and again. We damage their carriers. We sink their destroyers and escorts. And yet, their fleet grows larger. Where are these ships coming from? How many carriers does America possess? The answer came in the largest carrier operation of the war. In March 1945, Task Force 58 sortied from Ulithi for strikes against the Japanese home islands. Admiral Mark Mitcher, the same officer who'd reviewed Essex-Class designs in 1939, now commanded a force that would have seemed like fantasy just 3 years earlier. 11 fleet carriers, 7 of them Essex-Class, 4 light carriers, 6 battleships, 17 cruisers, and 63 destroyers. Nearly 2,400 aircraft flew from the American carriers, more than the entire Japanese Naval Air Force could muster for the defense of Japan itself. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, a Japanese radar operator at the Kasumigaura base near Tokyo, tracked the American approach on March 18th with growing horror. The radar scope showed not individual aircraft, but a solid mass of returns filling the screen. "How many aircraft?" his commanding officer asked. Tanabe checked and rechecked his equipment, thinking it must be malfunctioning. "Sir, the radar shows over 400 aircraft inbound. They're coming in waves. I count at least 6 separate formations." "That's impossible. No carrier force can launch 400 aircraft." "Sir, if the Americans have 11 carriers in the task force, and each carrier launches 40 aircraft, that's 440 aircraft. The mathematics is precise." The officer fell silent. Both men understood what this meant. Japan's home islands were being attacked by a carrier force larger than the entire Japanese Navy at its peak strength in 1942. Every assumption about American limitations had proven false. Every calculation about production capacity had been wrong. The Essex-Class carriers, those vessels Japanese intelligence had once dismissed as propaganda, now operated in such numbers that they could darken the skies over Japan itself. The March strikes devastated Japanese airfields, destroyed hundreds of aircraft on the ground, and sank dozens of ships in Japanese harbors. Kamikazes struck back, hitting several carriers, including Franklin, which suffered the worst damage any American carrier sustained during the war. A single Japanese dive bomber penetrated the task force's defenses at dawn on March 19th, planting 2 bombs on Franklin's flight deck just as aircraft were being armed and fueled for a strike. The explosions were catastrophic. Fully fueled aircraft detonated. Ammunition cooked off in cascading explosions. Fires raged through 3 decks. The carrier listed 13 degrees, dead in the water, seemingly doomed. Destroyer USS Santa Fe came alongside to fight fires and evacuate wounded despite bombs and rockets exploding on Franklin's deck. Captain Leslie Garris, Franklin's commanding officer, refused to abandon ship. "We built this carrier to take punishment," he told his crew over the ship's announcing system. "Now we're going to prove it. All hands not engaged in firefighting, report to damage control stations. We're saving this ship." And they did. For 3 hours, Franklin's crew fought fires that should have sunk her. They jettisoned burning aircraft. They flooded magazines before explosions could reach them. They welded ruptured bulkheads. They kept the engineering spaces operating despite fires raging above. By afternoon, Franklin was making 5 knots under her own power. By the next day, 15 knots. She limped back to Pearl Harbor, then transited to New York for repairs, sailing across the Pacific and through the Panama Canal with damage that would have sunk any earlier carrier. Franklin's survival exemplified why the Essex-Class dominated the Pacific War's final year. They were tough, well-designed ships crewed by damage control parties trained to fight fires and floods as intensively as fighter pilots trained for combat. More importantly, Franklin's near loss didn't cripple Task Force 58's operations. While she retired for repairs, Intrepid, Yorktown, Wasp, and Bennington continued launching strikes. The force hadn't lost its offensive capability. It had merely reduced by one carrier, from 11 to 10, a reduction America's production capacity could replace in 6 weeks. As spring turned to summer in 1945, the Essex-class carriers tightened their noose around Japan. They supported the invasion of Okinawa, destroying thousands of kamikazes before they could reach the invasion fleet. They struck Japanese airfields across Kyushu and Shikoku, destroying aircraft faster than Japanese factories could build them. They ranged along the Japanese coast, their aircraft attacking anything that moved: ships, trains, trucks, aircraft on airfields. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, preparing for what he knew would be his final mission in August 1945, wrote his last diary entry. "The enemy has proven unstoppable. Their carriers are everywhere. Their aircraft are innumerable. We struck them at Midway and believed we'd gained time. We damaged them at the Philippine Sea and learned we'd accomplished nothing. They replaced every loss twice over. Admiral Yamamoto told us this would happen. We should have listened." On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2 aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Surrounding the battleship as honor guard were 11 American aircraft carriers, 6 of them Essex-class vessels that had fought across the Pacific from Tarawa to Tokyo Bay. Their flight decks, scarred by combat and kamikaze strikes but still operational, carried aircraft ready for combat if Japan reneged on the surrender. Captain Toshikazu Omai, arriving for the surrender ceremony aboard the destroyer Hatsuzakura, looked up at the American carrier force filling Tokyo Bay. He counted the carriers slowly, methodically, wanting to know the final tally of his nation's defeat. 12 carriers, and these were just the ones in Tokyo Bay. Task Force 38 had more operating off the coast. More were arriving from the States. More were under construction in American shipyards that had never stopped building, never slowed production, never accepted limitations. "How many do they have total?" asked Lieutenant Commander Haruki Iki, standing beside Omai at the rail. "I've heard 24 Essex-class carriers were completed," Omai replied. "Plus light carriers, escort carriers, more being built. The exact number doesn't matter. What matters is that they could build them faster than we could sink them. That was always the answer. We just refused to see it." The two officers fell silent, watching as American aircraft launched from the carriers on what would be the final combat air patrols of the war. The cycles continued: launch, recover, rearm, repeat, with mechanical efficiency that had characterized American carrier operations since the Essex first deployed in 1943. Japan had sunk 4 American carriers in 1942 and believed it had bought time, perhaps years, to consolidate its conquests and build defenses. America had responded by commissioning 14 Essex-class carriers by war's end, with 10 more completed shortly after. The mathematics were merciless. The lesson was complete. And standing in Tokyo Bay aboard a destroyer watching the surrender of his nation, Captain Omai finally understood what Admiral Yamamoto had tried to tell them 3 years earlier. You couldn't defeat a nation that treated aircraft carrier construction as a production problem rather than a shipbuilding challenge. You couldn't win a war against an enemy who solved industrial limitations through standardization mass production, and unlimited resources. You couldn't fight mathematics and win. The Essex-class carriers had proven that truth in the most definitive way possible. By simply existing in numbers Japan couldn't match, launching strikes Japan couldn't stop, replacing losses Japan couldn't inflict fast enough to matter. Numbers that Commander Genda had studied in Truk Lagoon in 1943. The statistics that seemed impossible then were confirmed by war's end with devastating precision. American shipyards hadn't just met their production targets, they'd exceeded them. 24 Essex-class carriers ordered, 24 completed. 14 commissioned in time to fight in World War II. 10 more completed by 1950. Not one lost to enemy action, despite facing kamikazes, bombs, torpedoes, and everything the Japanese military could throw at them. The construction statistics told a story of industrial capacity that Japanese planners had never imagined possible. Newport News Shipbuilding, which had built the prototype Essex, completed 7 Essex-class carriers total. Brooklyn Navy Yard built 5. Philadelphia Navy Yard 3. Norfolk Navy Yard 4. Bethlehem Quincy 2. New York Navy Yard 3. 6 major shipyards working simultaneously, each one capable of handling multiple carriers in various stages of construction. At peak production in 1944, American shipyards were launching an Essex-class carrier every 7 weeks on average. The fastest construction time, USS Bonhomme Richard, took just 14 months and 17 days from keel laying to commissioning. During that same period, Japan completed exactly 0 fleet carriers to replace the 4 lost at Midway. The workers who built these vessels came from every corner of American society. Martha Hayes, a former schoolteacher from Virginia, learned to weld at Newport News Shipbuilding in 1942. By 1944, she was a lead welder on CV-19 Hancock, supervising a crew of 30 women welding the carrier's hull sections. "We knew boys, our brothers, sons, boyfriends, were dying in the Pacific," she told an interviewer in 1987. "Every weld we made, every piece of steel we joined, we knew it would protect someone's son. That knowledge made us better welders than any regulation could." The Essex-class construction employed over 100,000 workers across 6 shipyards at peak production. Electricians who'd wired houses learned to install complex fire control systems. Plumbers became pipe fitters for steam systems operating at pressures that would explode a residential water heater. Riveters, welders, crane operators, machinists, all working 3 shifts around the clock, 7 days a week, creating carriers with a consistency that made them interchangeable parts in America's Pacific offensive. Each Essex-class carrier required precise quantities that demonstrated the scale of American industrial mobilization. 30,000 tons of steel, 1,200 electric motors ranging from tiny actuators to massive turbine drive motors, 8 miles of electrical cable, 40,000 light bulbs, 6,000 valves controlling everything from fuel flow to steam pressure, 2 million rivets, hundreds of tons of electronics, radar sets, radio systems, fire control computers, plotting boards. The Westinghouse turbines alone represented engineering achievements that Japanese industry couldn't replicate. 4 turbines per carrier, each one producing 37,500 shaft horsepower, machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, balanced perfectly to operate at thousands of rotations per minute for months without maintenance. American factories produced 96 of these turbine sets for the Essex-class alone, plus dozens more for other carriers, battleships, and cruisers. But beyond the statistics lay human stories of transformation. Sarah Chen, whose family had immigrated from China in 1920, learned electrical systems at Brooklyn Navy Yard despite facing discrimination both for being Asian and for being a woman. She installed electrical panels on CV-16 Lexington in 1942, then CV-20 Bennington in 1944. The carriers didn't care about my skin color or gender, she reflected in a 1995 interview. They just needed good work, and we gave them work that could save lives. The Japanese discovered exactly how good that work was through painful experience. In post-war interrogations, Japanese naval officers consistently expressed shock at the quality of American carrier construction. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who commanded the mobile fleet at the Philippine Sea, gave testimony in 1946 that revealed the psychological impact of facing Essex-Class carriers. We knew the Americans had industrial capacity, Ozawa told American naval intelligence officers. But we assumed, because our experience taught us, that rapid construction meant poor quality. We expected these carriers to have mechanical problems, weak damage control, untrained crews. We were wrong on every assumption. He paused, then continued with the weariness of a defeated commander who'd learned hard lessons. The Essex-Class carriers operated with reliability that exceeded our peacetime standards. They recovered damaged aircraft we would have written off as losses. Their damage control parties saved ships that should have sunk. And their crews. We were told American sailors were soft, undisciplined. Instead, we faced the most professional Navy in the world. Admiral Ozawa wasn't alone in this assessment. Rear Admiral Toshitane Takata, who'd served in Japanese naval intelligence throughout the war, compiled a post-war report for American investigators analyzing why Japanese estimates of American carrier production had been so wrong. We made 3 critical errors, Takata wrote. First, we assumed carrier construction required 3 to 4 years minimum because that was our experience. We didn't understand standardization and mass production techniques. Second, we assumed America fighting in 2 oceans would divide their industrial capacity. We failed to grasp that their capacity was large enough to support both theaters simultaneously with resources to spare. Third, we believed our own propaganda about American weakness and decadence. This was perhaps our greatest error. The report continued with devastating honesty. When Commander Genda reported in late 1943 that American shipyards were producing Essex-Class carriers at impossible rates, many officers dismissed his intelligence as American disinformation. We couldn't accept that one nation could build fleet carriers as if they were merchant ships. By the time we accepted the reality, we faced 15 carriers at the Philippine Sea. By then, acceptance changed nothing. The Essex-Class carriers didn't just win battles, they changed naval warfare doctrine permanently. Before their introduction, naval theory held that carriers were fragile vessels requiring careful protection, that air operations required extended periods for preparation and recovery, that damage from a single bomb or torpedo could cripple a carrier for months. The Essex-Class proved every assumption wrong. They absorbed damage that would have sunk earlier carriers and continued fighting. Franklin took catastrophic hits that killed 724 men, yet reached New York under her own power. Bunker Hill suffered 2 kamikazes, killing 396 men, yet remained afloat and was repaired. Intrepid earned the nickname the Fighting Eye, not for avoiding damage but for repeatedly taking hits and returning to combat faster than Japanese intelligence believed possible. This resilience stemmed from design features American naval architects had incorporated based on hard lessons. Compartmentalization limited fire and flood spread. Redundant systems meant losing one generator or pump didn't cripple the ship. Damage control parties trained as intensively as fighter pilots could fight casualties before they became catastrophic. And perhaps most importantly, the Essex-Class was designed with the understanding that carriers would be hit. The question was whether they could survive and fight afterward. The post-war analysis by Japanese naval architects who examined captured American documentation revealed the philosophical difference between Japanese and American carrier design. Japanese carriers prioritized offensive capability. Larger air groups, faster aircraft, longer range. The Essex-Class balanced offensive power with survivability. The result was that Japanese carriers, when hit, often suffered catastrophic losses. American carriers, when hit, often continued operating. But the most devastating aspect of the Essex-Class program wasn't any single carrier's capabilities. It was the sheer numbers that American production sustained. Captain Toshikazu Omai, in his extensive post-war memoir, wrote the most comprehensive Japanese analysis of American carrier operations. A single Essex-Class carrier was formidable but not unbeatable. Our Zuikaku could match one Essex in combat capability. What we couldn't match was 15 Essex-Class carriers operating as a coordinated fleet. When we damaged one carrier, 2 more took its place. When we sank their escort carriers, fleet carriers replaced them. When we concentrated forces to attack their carrier groups, we discovered they had more carrier groups than we had forces to concentrate. Omai continued, "The Americans didn't defeat us through superior tactics or braver crews. They defeated us through mathematics. They calculated correctly that if they could build carriers faster than we could sink them, eventual victory was certain. We lost 4 carriers at Midway and believed we'd inflicted a decisive blow. They lost 1 carrier, and by war's end had commissioned 14 Essex-Class replacements. That ratio, 4 to 14, tells the entire story of the Pacific War. The human cost of this industrial imbalance was equally stark. The Essex-Class carriers participated in every major Pacific campaign from 1943 forward. They supported the invasions of Tarawa, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Leyte, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. They struck Japanese positions from the Solomons to the home islands. They shot down thousands of Japanese aircraft, sank hundreds of Japanese ships, and destroyed Japanese air power so thoroughly that by 1945, kamikazes, suicide attacks, represented Japan's only viable response to American carrier dominance. The cost to American carrier crews was significant. Over 8,000 men killed serving aboard Essex-Class carriers during World War II, with thousands more wounded. But the losses Japan suffered dwarfed American casualties. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost over 70,000 sailors and aviators killed in carrier operations and air combat. Japan trained approximately 15,000 pilots during the entire war. America trained over 60,000 naval aviators, with training pipelines that graduated hundreds monthly even at war's end. September 15, 1945. Yokosuka Naval Base, Japan. Commander Minoru Genda walked slowly along the waterfront where Japanese carriers had once moored. His limp pronounced from injuries suffered when American bombers struck his airbase in 1945. 2 years had passed since that September morning in Truk Lagoon, when he'd counted Essex-Class carriers on his intelligence charts and felt the first stirrings of inevitable defeat. The waterfront was empty now. No carriers, no battleships. Japan's combined fleet existed only in memory and in the wrecks scattered across the Pacific floor. But filling Tokyo Bay, visible from where Genda stood, were 11 American carriers, 6 of them Essex-Class vessels, their flight decks unmarked by any Japanese rising sun victory symbols, because no Japanese carrier had survived to claim such victories. Lieutenant Takeshi Naito, who'd delivered those terrible intelligence reports in Truk, found Genda standing at the water's edge. The young officer had survived the war, though barely. His left arm hung useless from wounds suffered during an air raid. "Chusa-sama," Naito said quietly. Genda no longer held rank. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been dissolved, but old habits persisted. "Do you remember that morning in Truk, when I brought you the reports about the 8th Essex-Class carrier commissioning?" Genda nodded slowly. "I remember. I remember thinking the numbers were impossible, that American propaganda had infiltrated our intelligence estimates. How many did they build in total?" 24 Essex-Class carriers ordered, 24 completed, plus 9 Independence-Class light carriers, over 100 escort carriers, dozens of cruisers, hundreds of destroyers. Genda's voice held no emotion. The numbers were simply facts now, no longer capable of causing pain because the pain was already total. "I toured one of them yesterday. Intrepid. The Americans allowed me aboard as part of the technical survey team." "What did you see?" "Everything Yamamoto warned us about. Quality construction, sophisticated systems, crew comfort that exceeded what we provided our officers. Battle damage. She'd taken 2 kamikazes, repaired so completely you could barely tell she'd been hit." Genda turned to face Naito. "Do you know what the American captain told me? He said Intrepid was hit 5 times during the war, 5 kamikaze strikes, and she never missed more than a few days of operations, except when they sent her back to the States for major refit." Naito looked out at the carriers in the bay. "Could we have won? If we'd negotiated peace after Midway, after the Coral Sea, could we have kept what we'd conquered?" "No." Genda's answer was immediate and certain. Because even then, even in 1942, the Essex-Class carriers were already under construction. The industrial capacity was already committed. The workers were already being trained. America was building the fleet that would defeat us even as we celebrated our victories. He paused. Yamamoto knew this. He tried to tell us. We should have listened. The 2 men stood in silence, watching the American carriers swing at anchor. Aircraft launched and recovered in regular cycles, the operations continuing even in peace because that was what carriers did. They operated, they trained, they maintained readiness. The Essex-Class hadn't stopped when the war ended. They simply continued, as inevitable as mathematics, as unstoppable as production lines. "What happens now?" Naito asked. "Now we rebuild Japan. We learn from this defeat, and we remember that wars between industrial nations are won in factories and shipyards before the first shot is ever fired." Genda turned away from the waterfront. "The Americans taught us that lesson with 24 Essex-Class carriers. We paid for that education with 3 million Japanese lives and an empire we never really possessed." As they walked away from the waterfront, neither man looked back at the carriers. They'd seen enough. They understood enough. The mathematics had proven merciless. The statistics told a story more devastating than any battle report. Japan sank 4 American carriers in 1942, Lexington at Coral Sea, Yorktown at Midway, Wasp in September, Hornet in October. America responded by commissioning 14 Essex-Class fleet carriers by war's end, with 10 more completed shortly after. The ratio said everything that needed saying about industrial warfare in the 20th century. Commander Genda, who'd helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack that started the war, now understood what Admiral Yamamoto had tried to tell them from the beginning. You couldn't defeat a nation whose shipyards treated aircraft carriers as production problems. You couldn't win a war against an enemy who standardized components, trained workers by the thousands, and applied assembly line techniques to warship construction. You couldn't fight American industrial capacity and expect victory. The Essex-Class carriers proved that truth in the most definitive way possible. They simply existed in numbers Japan couldn't match, operated with efficiency Japan couldn't replicate, and absorbed damage Japan couldn't inflict fast enough to matter. They were floating proof that the Second World War would be won not by the bravest soldiers or the best generals, but by the nation with the most factories, the most steel, the most workers, and the most profound understanding that modern warfare was ultimately about mathematics. 24 Essex-Class carriers, 14 battle stars earned collectively, 0 lost to enemy action, over 70,000 sorties flown, thousands of Japanese aircraft destroyed, hundreds of ships sunk, and most devastating of all, built faster than Japan could sink them, produced in numbers that made Japanese resistance ultimately futile. The pencil had stopped trembling in Commander Genda's hand long ago. The intelligence reports no longer shocked him. The statistics no longer seemed impossible. Standing in Yokosuka in September 1945, watching the Conqueror's carriers fill Tokyo Bay, Genda finally understood what those numbers had meant all along. They'd meant Japan had already lost the war before it began. The mathematics of industrial warfare decided the Pacific War long before the final battle. While Japan struggled to replace 4 carriers lost at Midway, American shipyards launched 14 Essex-Class carriers by war's end, 1 every 6 weeks at peak production. This wasn't just superior strategy, it was superior industry applied to warfare. Want more untold stories of how industrial capacity decided World War II? Subscribe and hit the notification bell. We explore the weapons, logistics, and production miracles that changed history, told through the eyes of those who witnessed them.